All right, this section of thermal physics talks about how much heat is added to a particular object to cause it to raise its temperature by a certain degree. This is all what thermal physics is about. So if I take a look here, it says if heat is added to a body, its temperature rises. But the actual amount of temperature that the body increases by is purely dependent on that particular object. So oftentimes we can refer to an object's thermal capacity, which gets a capital letter C. And if you look at my definition here for thermal capacity, it says the thermal capacity of a body is the amount of heat needed to raise its temperature by 1 degree Celsius. Okay, and I've given you joules, or units here of joules per degree Celsius, and it's got a fairly simple formula. The thermal capacity is the amount of heat required to change its temperature by a certain value of temperature. Okay, so if we just found it for 1 degree, then that would be the amount of joules per degree Celsius. Now, this thermal capacity, though, it does depend on the size of the object, and it also depends on what the material is made out of. So, to get a little more specific, we've got something called specific heat capacity. So specific heat capacity depends only on the material. It says raising the temperature of 1 kilogram of water requires more heat than raising 1 kilogram of steel the same amount. And you can, I wouldn't do this if I were you, but if you put a paper clip on your stove, it heats up really fast. It takes not a whole lot of energy to heat up that particular piece of metal. It heats up really quick, whereas water takes a few minutes before it starts to boil. That's because it would have, a different specific heat than, say, water does. Okay, so we have something called specific heat capacity. And the specific heat capacity of any material is the amount of heat required to raise the temperature of 1 kilogram of the material by 1 degree Celsius. So you'll notice that really the only difference between thermal capacity and specific heat capacity is that the specific heat capacity takes into account the mass and the type of material that it is. Okay, so if you look here, they use lowercase c for the specific heat capacity, and the units are a little different. We've got joules per kilogram degrees Celsius. So kilograms and degrees Celsius is on the bottom, and this is the basic formula, where C is the specific heat, Q is the amount of heat in joules, energy, M is the mass, and delta T is your change in temperature.